Well, plans are underway for a brand new TV documentary series on the 1973 Pascagoula alien encounter that featured Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson. Philip Mantle and Dr. Irena Scott have worked tirelessly on this case for the last few years and have uncovered a great deal of new information. Plus, a whole host of new first-hand eyewitnesses have also stepped forward, and Philip Mantle is joining us. Hi, Philip.
Yeah, good afternoon, Dean. Nice to speak to you.
Same here. Well, what's the latest on the Pascagoula television documentary?
Well, it's no longer just in meetings. Things are starting to move. This actually goes back to pre-pandemic days, Dean, where a documentary crew came to interview me, and I said, "Oh, by the way, have a read of this when you go." And I gave them a copy of Calvin Parker's first book, and they came more or less straight back to us, said, "Well, we're interested in this." Mm-hmm. So we made an agreement then, but then of course the pandemic came, and that put paid to anything. And thankfully, once all the restrictions were lifted, they came back again and revised the contract slightly. And they're like a lot of businesses, Dean, that have got a lot of things to catch up with. And once they caught up, it was right. Let's start planning it and make a date to start filming it. So the first step was me to send them any sort of audio or visuals that I had. So I've got audio recordings and some film clips. I also pointed them in direction of where they can get, vintage film clips of Charlie and Calvin. And I sent them a whole raft of photographs and documents and so on. So that was the first stage. And then it was right. We're ready to go. So the plan is, and they've already been in touch with Calvin Parker, that they will start filming in September, beginning with Calvin. Then, as you mentioned, Dr. Irena Scott and I, we will both be consultants on this. We are in the process of finishing a new book that will be out next year. It's the 50th anniversary of the encounter. Mm-hmm. And literally just this week, some more witnesses have stepped forward. So I sent them a draft of the book as it stands now. And the producer read that. And I think it was just last week, Dean, literally, he sent me a list of the people he would like to interview. Some of those, of course, are now deceased, like Sheriff Diamond and things like that. But he said, "I know some of these will not be available, but I'll put them on the list anyway." Right. And I think all but one on the list, we were able to provide contact details for phone numbers, email addresses, things of that nature. And it's now gone back to the producer, and now it's down to them. They will be on the telephone or on email, lining up the various interviews. But September, I don't have a date yet in September, but September is starting date. And of course, this is also aimed at next year for the anniversary. It's just, the pandemic may have done us a favor in some respects, Dean, because even though we were stuck in these four walls, we could still contact you, that we could still do our research. And we did. We found a number of new witnesses and other things during the pandemic, during lockdown. And that's now all available, of course, to the production company. And I am very pleased to see it's moving forward.
Okay. Is it just a one-off documentary, Philip, or will it be a series?
It'll be a series. At the moment, they're looking at a 3-part series. I suspect it may end up being longer than that. Once the interview, Calvin will talk for 3 or 4 hours anyway. Yeah. Yep. So it's going to be a lot of editing in that respect. But that's down to them. I don't have any control over that. But they're looking that it will also go on to DVD at some point. Now, this company has never done that with their products before, so this is a really special production for them. They're doing things with this that they've never done with any of their other productions, which again is only good for us. So at the moment, it's only 3. we have a working title for it, but I've just put that on our provisional book cover. That will probably change.
Yep.
Again, once they've got everyone under interview, the title will come up somewhere along the line, and we'll be up and away.
Okay. Have you got any intel on any big names being involved in, say, the narration of the series?
I don't know about narration. I mean, I'll be involved. I'm hoping Dr. Scott will be, because she lives in Ohio. Now, I've said it would be nice if you could take an internal flight and interview her in person, because without Irena, this would not have been impossible. It would have been a lot more difficult, and we've worked hand in glove together. But I said, failing that, at the very least, we should have her on Zoom or some such thing, because her contribution must be recognized. Then one of the things we did with the case, I found a newspaper cutting going back to 1973, and it was, I can't remember the gentleman's name, but it was the head man who ran NICAP at the time, the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomena. And he said, since the Parker-Hickson encounter, we've been inundated with phone calls, etc., etc. Now, my friend and colleague David Marler, who lives in Albuquerque, has an amazing archive of material, Dean, and he happens to be the custodian, amongst other things, of the NICAP files.
Wow.
So I went to David and I said, look, found this clipping. Can you give us a selection of some of the cases that came in after Hickson and Parker, just to illustrate that point? And he sent me I could have probably done a whole book just on the cases he sent me, but I had to narrow them down. They weren't all in the Mississippi area. I'm talking about here across the states here, mainly in the South. So we have a whole chapter on the NICAP files. So I'm hoping that they will also be referenced in the documentary, and David Marler interviewed along with the NICAP files, and so it's just an interesting development that just popped up, and we've added that to the book.
Fantastic. Well, there's always a lot of new viewers that start to follow the UFO phenomenon. They may not have heard, the new ones may not have heard of what Pascagoula was about. I mean, we probably should just explain briefly what it was about and why it was such a worldwide event at the time.
Well, I'll give you an idea. When I set out to try and find Calvin Parker back in 2018, I contacted a UFO group in Mississippi, and they had never heard of the case.
Wow.
They sent me some links. They just Googled it. So, excuse me. So, so you're right, there are people that have never heard of the case. And for those that are not aware, it was October the 11th, 1973. Calvin Parker was almost 19, and his colleague and friend, Charlie Hickson, was 42. This is Pascagoula, Mississippi. They both worked on the shipyard. Calvin, in fact, lived 200 miles away, but it just arranged to get married. And he got a regular job, and he was going to stay with Charlie, Monday to Friday, and go home on a weekend. Charlie's family and Calvin's family grew up together. This was Calvin's first day on the job as a welder. So he worked all day. And the one thing that both men shared and interesting was fishing. So Calvin's driving home at night, and Charlie says, "Can I go fishing tonight?" "Yeah." So they get the tackle, they stop, they buy some bait, and they drive up. This is not an out of the way place, Dean. It's right next to Highway 90. There's a huge bridge goes over the river. They stop at one point, but it's infested with flies. So they move to an old abandoned pier, a shipyard that had closed. So they're fishing off this old pier. And when they were driving in, they passed a no entry sign. Calvin wasn't happy about that, but Charlie said, "I don't worry about it." So Calvin stood on the pier with his rod in the water. I'd often wondered what fishermen think about, and he said, "I'm just watching the ships go by, And he says, then there's this blue light comes from behind, and it goes across the water, and he thinks, it's the police. I knew we shouldn't have ignored the no entry sign. We're going to spend the night in jail. So him and Charlie almost simultaneously turn around, because it's not the police.
Mhm.
It's this rugby ball shaped thing descending. It stopped about 18 inches above the ground, give off this intense blue light which hurt their eyes. I think there was 2 lights on the left-hand side, and this opening appeared, which this light came out again, and these 3 figures floated, and I mean floated. They didn't touch the ground, about 2 feet off it. They were humanoid, but they were described as having no neck. They had carrot-like protrusions sticking out the side and one out the front. Their arms were a bit longer than ours. They had mitten or crab-like appendages. Their legs were fused together and they never moved. And their appearance, they described it as being grey-coloured, but like an elephant's skin, all wrinkly. Right. 2 got hold of Charlie, 1 got hold of Calvin, took them on board. There was a kind of examination. Calvin said he saw a female of these creatures, and she did some pretty nasty things to him. And then they were put back out on the pier. I'm cutting it all down here. And this thing was gone. Calvin was out of his mind. I mean, literally scared witless. And he asked Charlie, let's not tell anybody. So they, to begin with, they had agreed not to tell anyone. So they get back to the car, the window smashed on the passenger side. This was a brand new car. It wouldn't start. Calvin says it took me, maybe 20 attempts to get it going, and off they went. Now, as they're driving down the road, Charlie, who'd been in the military and fought in Korea, had a change of heart. He says, no, what if this thing comes back, does this to someone else? So they reach an agreement. He'll call the authorities, but he will say that the moment these things came out of the craft, Calvin passed out and can't remember anything else, because he was out of his mind. So they phoned Keesler Air Force Base, and they said, well, sorry, we don't deal with UFOs anymore. Ring your local authorities. So they phoned, and it ended up with the Jackson County Sheriff's Department. They went into town. They were interviewed separately to begin with, and then they were put in a room together, and the deputy left. And there was a table there. They thought nothing of it. The deputy come back a few minutes later, took something out of the table, and they'd been secretly recorded. So they played it back, the deputy and the sheriff, and there's Calvin and Charlie still talking about what had happened to them. Calvin's climbing the walls, literally. So the sheriff then believed them. And he said, look, guys, you better go home. So they made the sheriff promise not to tell anyone. So next morning they got up, go to work. And as they approached the shipyard, they see there's a few more cars there than there normally is, because the media had arrived. And to this day, Calvin has no idea how the story got out. He hadn't got a clue, but it was out. And, Charlie went on to talk about it. He went on the Dick Cavett show. Calvin largely tried to avoid it. It was a bit like the Hulk in the 1980s TV show. He kept moving from town to town with his wife and his family. And Charlie published a book in 1983, which I republished in 2017. And then I met Calvin, published 2 books by Calvin in 2018 and 2019. That's the story so far. That's what happened to them. There's a lot more to it, but that's like a condensed version. Yeah,
and it was, to me, what fascinated me most. I mean, the abduction itself was terrifying, but it's what happened afterwards. It was the circus that happened afterwards. And
well, it was a circus, and of course, Alan Hynek appeared out of nowhere, and Calvin again couldn't believe how quick he got there. He said he must have been somewhere in the area, and then a chap from APRO called Dr. James Harder. And they held a press conference, and Hynek says, these men are authentic. They've had an experience, period, and you should treat them with respect. And for decades, it was rumored that this was Hynek's favorite case, because later that year, he formed the Center for UFO Studies. Calvin is now friends with Hynek's son, Paul Hynek.
Right.
And Paul remembers Charlie and Calvin phoning their father at home, because as a young man, he was the one that normally answered the phone, yes, there was a lot more happened afterwards, and that's, you know, a big part of the story itself.
Yeah. You know, the documentary is going to be a great piece of recorded evidence on this particular event, but I just wish someone in Hollywood would just have the smarts enough to realize that they don't have to make anything up with this story. I mean, it's all there. I mean, it would be a blockbuster in my view.
It is. I mean, we've been working with a producer. We have a screenplay written as a movie, and we also have it written as a five-part drama series.
Right.
Because like you said, it wasn't just what happened that night. There was lots of other things that happened that night, but it's what happened to these two gentlemen afterwards. Charlie largely could, you know, he dealt with it pretty much okay. And he was quite happy to speak about it, but Calvin, it was like a curse, you know, and he literally would move from town to town. He even thought of suicide at one point. And
wow,
he phoned, this is a true story, he phoned his insurance company and said, am I covered for suicide? And they said, no. So he went into a cowboy bar and picked a fight with 6 cowboys, thinking that, you know, they beat the living daylights out of him, literally. And
yeah.
his wife would get the insurance money because it wasn't suicide, but they did beat the living daylights out of him.
Wow.
But just, you know, he staggered out of the bar in one piece, more or less. So it did have a drastic effect on Calvin. And once he wrote the book, it was kind of like you could see this weight being lifted off him. People treated him with respect. The town even raised some money, and there's a historical marker near the location now, recognizing this was officially opened by the mayor. No taxpayers' money was used. It was a charity that raised the money. And, you know, on opening day, Calvin was stood beside this, crying his eyes out, literally crying his eyes out.
Yep.
And it was nice that although Charles Hickson has passed away in 2011, his eldest son, Eddie, was there. Which Calvin hadn't seen in many years. So that was great. And we've even interviewed Eddie Hickson for the new book because he's a first-hand witness to what happened to his father and his mother. We forget about the partners that were there.
Yep.
You know, so in the book, we even have an interview with Calvin's wife, Waynette, because she was the girl he got engaged to all those years back. We blamed her, actually. It's her fault. You know? So we've done an interview with Waynette.
Yeah, I've always maintained that the Pascagoula was the first leg of the big trifecta during the 70s, followed by Travis Walton in 75, and then Devil's Den incident in 77. But I mean, it's one of the biggest of all time. Well,
you know, I initially, when I contacted Calvin, I only wanted an interview with him, and we knew there were witnesses because there is some vintage film clips. Shows a chap called Jerry Booth. At the time in 1973, I think he was a gas station owner, and he talked about the thing he saw that night. And bearing in mind the location, we also spoke to some of the police officers who were on duty that night. So we had lots and lots of phone calls. So we knew there were other witnesses, but we were amazed at what was about to happen. Calvin made a little mini sort of video, 8 minutes, for a local news station, and somebody put it on YouTube. And a young lady left a message saying, my mum and dad were on the opposite side of the river that night, and they too saw the UFO.
Wow.
So I got in touch with her. She put us in touch with their parents, and they are all interviewed. It's all in the book, and will all be in the documentary.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So you say, like, the witnesses, well, those particular witnesses saw the UFO. Did they actually see the abduction take place?
Couldn't see the abduction because it was too far away. But there was something that puzzled both of them. This is Mr. and Mrs. Blair. You know, the names are out there. Mr. Blair was working in the fishing industry, waiting for a boat to come in, and it was late. It wasn't in the best of moods. And sadly, he's now passed away. But before he did, he told us that he thinks they too had an encounter that night. And not just him and his wife, because they didn't just see the blue light opposite. As they're walking along the pier, when his boat came in, Mrs. Blair said there was this huge splash in the water next to us. And she says, when I looked down, and these are her words, she says, there's a grey man in the water.
Wow.
Mr. Blair said, I saw this grey humanoid, again, those are his words, come up out of the water, start to go back across the river. And Mrs. Blair said, I can see something, but it's just in my peripheral vision. And I can't quite make it out what it is. And then she said something that's, stuck with me straight away. She said, I'd always wondered if something hadn't happened to us like happened to Charlie and Calvin. And I'll leave it there. All will be revealed in the documentary and the book.
Okay.
And so that'll give you a little hint.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you get a gauge of why people stayed silent, all those years?
Yeah, absolutely. One was, who the hell do you report it to? There's no Ghostbusters.
Yeah.
There's no way, then they saw Charlie and Calvin being hounded by the media. One chap told us, for example, he said he switched on one channel and the TV station was, treating it fairly seriously. You turned over onto another channel and they were just ridiculing it, calling them two drunken hicks or two drunken rednecks or whatever. So he said, there's no way am I going to put myself through that. So those were the main two reasons. One, they didn't know who to report anything to. Bear in mind, the gentleman in the police force who took Charlie Hickson's call that night said he had at least 50 reports phoned to the Jackson County. So some people did report it, but they reported it to the police. There is no records of that. They've all gone, of course, but I don't doubt him. And he said, when I went into the police station, there were people there in person reporting it.
Right.
So we also managed to find some sightings that were a few days before it and some that were in the week or so after it. But it seems that whatever happened to Charlie and Calvin, that was like the epicenter of it. That was the peak. And we've documented all of that as best we can.
Right. I saw a recent proposal made by a US senator yesterday from Wisconsin about protecting UFO witnesses and whistleblowers. I think that, if that comes off, that he's going to look for an amendment to be made next year. But if it comes off, it's going to impact how much official information we get on UFOs, and hopefully it will encourage a lot more people to come forward and talk about them. Well,
yeah, the one thing that's always stopped people, Dean, as you well know, is the stigma. And like I said, the encounter back in 1973 was such a huge story. I'm still amazed today how I still find newspaper cuttings, magazine cuttings. I've even had one literally sent today that I'd never seen before, and there is Charlie and Calvin in it. And so, they saw what happened. And a lot of them decided, I'm not going to stick my neck out. I spoke to one gentleman and he said, well, I told my family and that's good enough for me. And he literally said, who am I going to call? He said, I've told my family and friends and that was it. He didn't keep it secret. And that's the same with a lot of them. He said, well, I told my mother, or I told my best friend, or I told my family, my children. Same with Mr. and Mrs. Blair. They hadn't breathed a word of it. The only two people they'd told are their two daughters. And it was one of their daughters who left that message on YouTube. And she only knew a small part of the story. She hadn't been told it all. So, and others keep coming forward now. I just say within the last 2 weeks, we've interviewed 3 new witnesses who saw something not in Pascagoula, but nearby, and those will be all entered into the new book accordingly.
Yeah, interesting times too, Philip. You could almost see the normalization of unidentified flying objects materialize in front of our eyes.
Well, it is being treated, with respect in most places. You still get the silly headlines here and there, but we have to remember newspapers are there to sell newspapers.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to go along with that. But, you know, it is being taken serious. It's in mainstream. And let's hope it stays that way for as long as possible. And we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Last time we spoke, Calvin was struggling a little with his health. How is he doing now?
Well, he's still struggling, but he's a tough old boot. You know, he told me the story. He had his brother. His brother was the brains in the family, and he was the brawn. So if anybody picked on his brother at school, they had Calvin to reckon with. So he's a tough old guy, and but yeah, he's you know, he's had some health problems, but fingers crossed he'll get through it.
Fantastic. Well, terrific update, Philip. Well, I hope you keep us posted on what continues to happen. Just before we close off, you took part in a 75th Roswell anniversary television event on July 7th on Blaze, I think Blaze TV.
Yeah.
What was the format and how did it play out?
Well, the format was there's 4 of us involved mainly. And, you know, there is a skeptical side of it, but what the production company decided to do was to take the timeline, look at the timeline of Roswell, starting with the end of the Second World War and the atomic bombs. And they'd move through the timeline of Roswell. And then we'd go back and examine each point on that timeline, you know, the significant events, and put pro and con arguments, you know, and other ideas and other suggestions. So there was a mixture. It wasn't a skeptical look at it. It wasn't a pro look at it. It was a mixture of this. And at the end of the day, you leave the viewers to try and, you know, come to their own conclusion. And it's been very well received. I mean, you can't please everybody. It's also going out on Sky History. And I think Blaze ran it twice. And we got some nice emails from the people at the top of Blaze who were extremely happy with it. And I dare say it will filter through to other channels accordingly. Again, that's, you know, I'm not in charge of any of that. I'm just one of the hired hands, so to speak.
Right. Well, before you go, your book, I think it's UFO UK landings. How's that doing?
UFO landings UK. Yeah, it's doing all right. It's something I've had on the back burner for years. One of the good things to come out of lockdown, Dean, I got it finished.
Fantastic.
So I originally uploaded it ready for publication in 2020. And we are making a documentary about it. That is finished. It's based on the book. It's not exactly the book, but it's based on it. So that is now finished. So I decided to release the book this year without changing anything. So that's doing okay. Thank you very much. And I don't have an update on when the documentary will be ready, but all the filming is done. It's now down to the editing and scheduling. But I'll keep you posted when that's ready.
Terrific. Thank you, Philip.
My pleasure, Dean. Anytime.
Philip Mantle joining us today.